Hey everybody, welcome back to the last of our Psychotherapy Networker Facebook Live interviews for today. We're winding down Creativity Day. I have here with me Alexandra Solomon. Alexandra is a professor at Northwestern. She's a therapist. Alexandra, for starters, tell me a little bit about yourself and your work.
Sure, I am happy to be here. This feels like a homecoming every year that I get to come down and nerd out with therapists for the weekend. So my career has a few different parts to it. I'm a couples therapist. I work with couples and individual adults. I also am a faculty member at Northwestern University. I teach and train our graduate students in marriage and family therapy, how to do couples therapy, and then I teach an undergraduate relationship skill building class called Marriage 101 that we're about to start our 18th year teaching the class. And I also write and present to a variety of audiences. And last year wrote my first book called Loving Bravely.
Great. Well, congratulations.
Thanks.
And remind me, so you've been in practice for how long?
Oh my gosh. I've been doing therapy in some form or another for 20 years, but I've been licensed for, over 15 years.
Wow. All right. Fantastic. So I guess for starters, we want to ask you, as a parent, what do I need to keep in mind when I talk to my kids, teens, young adults, about dating, about love, about sex, all these milestones they'll go through?
Yeah. Well, this has been a topic that's been on my mind a lot. So my practice, my work week is sort of split between two populations. I have most of the couples I work with are in their 40s and 50s and have, kids ranging from 10 to 25 years old. And then I have graduate students and undergraduate students. So I sort of have a foot in each of these worlds. And so I've gotten really invested in sort of translating across those generational lines and just becoming really aware of how much silence there is oftentimes with parents around talking to their kids, their teens, and even their young adults about love, sex, relationship, partnership, and the silence is kind of deafening. And about a year ago, a group at Harvard came out with some data that indicated that 70% of young adults, 18 to 25, wish their parents would talk to them more about love. And 65% of them wish they had learned more about love and sex and partnership in school. And so that was, to me, like just such a validation of the work that I've been doing around encouraging young adults to talk to their parents about their stories, because those stories, how they've watched, we're all sort of these like little social scientists in our homes, and we're taking in messages since we're this high about touch, about emotion, about difference, about conflict, but we don't really make it explicit. And so in both the classes I teach, for my undergrads and for my grad students, every one of my students, every single year, has a project where they need to find their attachment figures and talk to them about their own love story. So they become almost like oral historians or anthropologists, and they're learning about how their own family system does love, and to make all of those implicit messages explicit. So this year I'll be talking with a therapist in my workshop about how to really encourage that work in whatever form that takes. So the first thing I would say to parents is just to not be afraid, to just open your mouth and start somewhere, because we're communicating stuff even when we're saying nothing at all.
Sure. I want to add, for those of you out there in Facebook land, this is a live Facebook interview. If you have questions for Alexandra, feel free to post them in the comment section below, and we'll take a look, and Alexandra will be happy to address them.
Absolutely.
Great. So on that note, if I'm a parent, can you give me an example of some icebreakers? Let's say I have a son or daughter, teenage daughter, who's particularly standoffish, or they're sort of clammed up about these issues. What sorts of things can I say to them to sort of get the ball rolling?
Yeah. Well, one is just to not be afraid to tell your own love story, to talk about when you were a teen and what you remember about your early crushes and the sort of feeling of butterflies in your stomach and whatever those early experiences were. Just sort of telling those stories is one way of greasing the wheels and opening the door to maybe invite our kids to start to share with us.
Sure.
One of my mentors had this system that she used in her family as she was raising her kids, and she called it little truth bombs, like little 60-second truth bombs. And they oftentimes would happen in the dark, in the car, and it would be just a little mini lesson about sex, about attraction, about pleasure, about sort of these topics that remain under the rug. And she would say, I'm going to talk for about a minute. You don't have to say a word at all. If you have questions, go ahead and ask them, but you're under no obligation. And I love that approach. It's a really low pressure approach. It's just sort of, I need to share this, but there's no expectation on your end of what you're going to do. And I think maybe past generations could have gotten away with a lot of silence, but the issue is that our kids now pick up their smartphones and they Google the stuff that's on their mind. So sexual curiosity, romantic curiosity, those are really, really normative kinds of things. And when families and schools leave a lot of room without conversation, kids are going to fill in that space by Googling. And 9 times out of 10, Google is not going to take you somewhere really rich and wholehearted around the kinds of questions that are on kids' minds, especially about sex.
Sure. So in your experience in working with these young adults, are they looking for that sort of connection from their parents? Even though they might not verbally say it, are you finding that they're usually receptive when a parent goes to them and says, well, here's my experience in dating, what do you think? Do you want to share?
Yeah, I mean, my experience by and large with the young adults, sort of 18 to 25-year-olds that I interface with, is that they are hungry for conversation. And they're hungry for curious, non-judgmental conversation, because we're all, I mean, with the advent of technology and social media, we're all kind of trying to figure out how we navigate that intersection of technology and love. And if you're married, it looks married in 40 looks different than single in 25. Certainly the kinds of issues are different. But we're all kind of on our kind of spinning with what this means and how social media affects our boundaries, our how we find love, how we maintain love. So I think that my experience is young adults are really hungry for just conversation. How did it used to work then? How does it work now? What do we need? And I think that those of us who've been around the sun a few more times can sort of talk about like the time before, like the sort of essential elements of love, the need to be face to face, the need for seduction, flirtation, like all of those sort of like elemental pieces that for young adults today kind of fall away with the advent of using apps.
Okay. Great. So the bulk of your work involves, correct me if I'm wrong, working with millennials, working with young adults. On the note of marriage, are millennials changing the face of marriage?
In some ways, yes, and in a lot of ways, no. So for sure, there's a sort of commonly understood idea is that for millennials, marriage is a capstone, not a cornerstone. So in other generations, marriage happened in sort of the early 20s. It was a first step towards adulthood. And by and large now, millennials they're marrying at lower rates, certainly, but they also are marrying later. So there are just more years between sexual maturity and saying I do. And they're filling that space with the need to fill that space kind of coincides with the use of apps and social media to find love. And so all of that sort of changes aspects of love. But by and large, and there are certainly more young adults who are practicing consensual non-monogamy. Certainly there is much more interest and openness around LGBT couples and couples that cross all kinds of cultural lines. So young adults are doing that at far higher numbers than older generations. But in terms of what marriage looks like, there still is a push and a curiosity about what's sort of tried and true or traditional.
Okay, great. How do you support the young adults who come into your office if they have fears about marriage or commitment? I guess what are some of the issues you typically see when it comes to working with young adults in the office?
Definitely fear and definitely ambivalence. Those are two for sure. And I have zero interest in telling people what they should do about the choices they make and the kinds of relationships they structure. But I have a lot of interest in supporting the how, like sort of the how that has to do with the need to build romantic relationships that are founded on relational self-awareness, which is sort of the heart of the Loving Bravely book. The idea being that the degree to which I know and understand and am curious about myself and my identity, my triggers, my wounds, my journey, my belief system, the degree to which I have that curious relationship with me is the degree to which I am really ready to partner with you in a way that is conscious and where the relationship kind of becomes this classroom that grows each of us as individuals and supports us as a couple. And it's hard for me, we expect a lot more out of our intimate relationships today than we did a generation ago. And so those kinds of foundational pieces around self-awareness are just, there's no way of getting around the need for that.
Sure. Actually, that sort of ties into one of my last questions. So the therapists the couples therapists who have been practicing for 30, 40 years, who maybe learned about love and marriage at a time when it looked very different, what sort of advice would you give to them? Do you have any recommendations?
Yeah. Well, I mean, they are the keepers of our stories. Like, we need them. We need their wisdom. We need their perspective. We need their longevity. We need them to talk to us about what it was then, what are the possibilities today that they did not have available to them, and what are the challenges that they see that we didn't have back then.
Sure.
So they are really essential kind of historians and keepers of knowledge and wisdom. And so to have those conversations be as rich as possible, it is incumbent upon the older generations to kind of manage judgment and fear and that sort of like tisk thing that we can get into across those generational lines, and just hold a space that is curious. I keep coming back to that word, but that idea of just being curious and sharing stories, and understanding. I think sometimes parents and older folks will silence themselves because they've had divorces, they've had breakups, they feel like they haven't done love the right way, and really trusting that there is as much wisdom that can come from a story of heartbreak as there is about a sort of like fairy tale story.
Sure. Great. Well, Alexandra, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
It's great to be
Please
here.
check back tomorrow. We'll have another 6 interviews over the weekend, so we hope you'll check in. Thank you so much. Have a great night.